Well, greetings, amazing students. Welcome back to another virtual lesson for this week. Again, I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person and talking about this topic in relation to our course together. But for today, what I'm going to do is prepare another brief mini lesson for you. The topic of today's lesson in relation to social problems for our class is going to discuss the origin of the Black Lives Matter movement so that we might better understand some of the policies as they exist in relation to social problems. The lightly for today's lesson, understanding, putting ourselves in the perspective of those who have experienced systemic policies, particularly related to the justice system and law enforcement, from another perspective, from the perspective of those who have been impacted differently in relation to being people of color, particularly the Black or African American community. And the reason why this particular topic is important to discuss is because, as we know, in our country, there is a lot of, still continues to be, tension and disagreements that are primed racially. Racial inequalities have been a systemic journey, in fact, woven into the history of our country that has contributed to the systemic oppression, not only of Black and African American individuals, but people of color. For today's lesson, though, due to the significance of social unrest that exists as a result of racial tension in this country, we'll be drawing a lens, sort of a microscope, on the Black Lives Matter movement. It's important to understand this in particular, or at least the origin of it. And the reason this is important is because individuals I hear sometimes out in the community speak about the Black Lives Matter movement in a way that is contradictory towards the origin of the movement. Sometimes BLM in particular is referred to as a militant group, an angry movement, a movement that is seeking to replace one oppressor with the other. In other words, to switch the role of dominant culture from white to Black, and then therefore Black or African American individuals would now be oppressing white individuals. And that is not the goal or the mission of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think sometimes it comes from sometimes a misunderstanding or interpretation of the origin of the movement. And so that's what I just want to be able to discuss today briefly. Now, here's the important thing to understand, that in a mini lesson, we're not going to cover all of the totality, right? The details, the intricacy, complexity of the Black Lives Matter movement. However, what we are going to do is give a brief overview. When we return to class and we're able to connect in person, then we'll continue this discussion, all right? But I think that this is a good starting point. It's important to note too, and I just want to give a precaution that for this lesson, some of the content that I'm going to share with you today may be triggering. Some of it may make you feel uncomfortable, emotional. It will break your heart sometimes as you're watching some of this content that I'm going to share with you. The reason for that, and please hear me in this, isn't for shock value or factor. The reason for this isn't to incite or to become polarizing. You're going to see that today's lesson is going to carry a message, an underlying message of snapshot or movie. I'm going to explain what that is in a moment here. I'd also like to give credit to the concept that when I was first introduced to the idea of the snapshot in the movie to a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Brown, who shared his perspective on the snapshot or movie, I am simply using Dr. Brown's illustration that he shared with me for the purpose of this lesson, because I think it speaks very eloquently to where we're headed in our discussions. So I just want to share that and give credit to Dr. Brown for sharing that with me. Now, here's what I'm going to do. For today's lesson, I'm going to share this content with you. We'll talk about particularly Black Lives Matter, the origin of the movement, and its association or connection to the killing of Trayvon Martin. And we're going to talk about that in particular. For that reason, like I said, some of the content will be triggering. If you ever need to get a hold of me following the lesson or you watch it, you know how to get a hold of me. Go ahead and email me. We'll set up a time to connect. I'm happy to do that with you, but I just want to give you that disclaimer while you're watching, okay? So let's go ahead and dive into the lesson for today, and we'll get started. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my screen and we can share that, and we'll get started. So I promised you today that in our discussion around racial inequities for this class, we are going to discuss Black Lives Matter movement, and I would like to put it into a context, right? So we understand why we're covering the material the way we are today. I recognize it's difficult sometimes to talk about racial inequalities, racial relations, and tension that exists in our country. Talking about race and racism is not easy. It can create uncomfortableness, if you will, simply because no one likes to be called a racist. No one likes to be labeled as that individual that's a bigot or prejudiced a group or doesn't stand for the equal treatment of others. And so there's a lot of tension around this. I'd like for us to give ourselves an opportunity to let some of that go for this lesson. Right? I'd like us to forget about that discussion of pointing fingers, and I'd like us for a second here to sit in some content, to view the Black Lives Matter movement, the facts around Trayvon Martin's case, and the origin of Black Lives Matter from the perspective of individuals who have lived a different experience than some of us. So in life, at times we look at life in a series of sometimes snapshots and movies. And I'm going to explain that a little more, right? A snapshot is a moment in time, like a camera here on the left, right? That we take a picture, it's frozen, and that's what happens. And when we show that picture to someone, we look at that picture and say, wow, what a beautiful picture. What a tense moment. Look at the emotion on that person's face. And that snapshot, that one still frame, paints for us an idea of thoughts, feelings, and our reactions, as a result, our behavior of how we respond to that picture. Other people, based on their experiences in life, have not only had one snapshot, though, they've had many snapshots over a period of time that has shaped their experience. We call that the movie. Instead of a movie being one still image, what is a movie? A series of frames shot in succession, right, that tell a long-term story, not only one snapshot. I bring this up because in the case of this summer with the killing of George Floyd, a lot of people were outraged, and rightfully so, and I'm glad to see that, right? People were outraged at what occurred, and they said that this is difficult, this is awful, this is painful to watch, my heart hurts, and we have to do something about it. They saw the image, the snapshot of George Floyd, and they said, we can't stand for this anymore, we have to do something about it. It's important to note that while those feelings are real, they're visceral, and they're important to have, that was a reaction by some, not all, to a snapshot, a moment in time, that issue related to George Floyd. And sometimes people equated then the Black Lives Matter movement to just the simple response to that snapshot. If that's the case, though, it's difficult because that is not necessarily the lens or experience that if you're Black or African American that you've been living with your entire life, or in your parents' life, or in your grandparents' life. You've been living not by a snapshot, but by a movie, a series of individual moments playing over and over in succession that led up to the George Floyd incident, yet another snapshot to add to their movie experience, saying, I am tired of this, I can't do this anymore, something has to change, something has to change. And so what I would encourage you to understand is this is why sometimes discussions around race and racism are difficult. Because some people will look at this and say, what happened to George Floyd was awful. And they're right, it was awful. But then other people may look at what happened to George Floyd and they make a connection and say, but that same type of incident happened to Trayvon Martin. It happened to Breonna Taylor. Right? It happened to all these individuals, a series of individuals over decades. And I would say if we want to look even systemically past that into the Jim Crow era for centuries of where individuals have been systemically murdered by systems, all right? And they're watching the movie of this take place, not the snapshot. For today's lesson, what I'm going to ask us to do is step away from the snapshot and be willing to look at this issue of the origin of Black Lives Matter, and particularly Trayvon Martin's case, from the sequence of a movie, understanding that what happened to Trayvon Martin has happened to other individuals in the past and continues to happen since that date, right? Not just one snapshot of what happened here. And if we could take that awareness into this discussion, I think it would do us well. So it's one thing to say and to recognize that people of color, particularly Black and African American individuals, may have experience higher rates, disproportionate rates of incarceration, disproportionate sentences, higher sentences in that case, disproportionate arrest rates, and disproportionate episodes of police brutality. It's another thing to see it, right? So what I'd like to do is play a short movie, right? Not the snapshot, but the movie of how some individuals that are people of color or Black or African-American community have seen police brutality play out in their lives different from a snapshot. So I'm going to start with this video. And then what we'll do is we'll move into the discussion of Black Lives Matter and the origin of that. So I'm going to stop the screen, and then I'm going to go ahead and share my next screen with the video for us to watch.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rugged red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Okay, I know that that video can be difficult. I know that it can be painful to watch, right? And I think it's important to note that as difficult as things are sometimes to see, for us to see, we have to understand that this is a reality that individuals have lived with their entire lives. Again, snapshot versus movie. The images on the screen that you see here involve people, children, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers, right? So when we talk about a broad term, like when we talk about racial inequity, when we talk about racism, we may talk about it in a very technical sense, sometimes in academia. It's important to understand, and then we're talking about it in the snapshot. But other people have lived the movie, right? These were people that people knew, right? That were killed, injured as a result, right, of these systemic issues, these social problems. So this is the snapshot versus the movie. Right? So taking that lens into this discussion, I'd like to have a discussion about the origin of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to do this in a way that might be a little different in order for us to immerse ourselves into some of the discussions and the experiences, and to remember the sounds and testimonies associated with this particular moment. In the summer of this year, of the summer of 2020, actually, what happened is that we heard a lot of discussions around Black Lives Matter, and we saw a lot of demonstrations, public demonstrations being held that look similar to this, right, with the Black Lives Matter slogan. We also heard and saw images, right, proclaiming all lives matter, red lives matter, blue lives matter, and many of us saw stickers, buttons, signs, right, claiming all lives matter. And then we also had some images here. You'll see these, right, on vehicles and sometimes on just signs and around and out and about with the red lives matter and blue lives matter, particularly more blue lives matter is what we have been seeing in the summer. It's important to understand these images here. There are other images too, are addressed and came about following the Black Lives Matter movement in response to, the Black Lives Matter movement. They came in response to that. They came in response to that because, like I was saying, some of our discussions around Black Lives Matter viewpoints in the community sometimes express that the Black Lives Matter movement is a militant movement. It's one that is there to engage in violence when the origin of the movement is far different from that. So what I would like to do is give you a few facts related to the origin of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then what I would like to do is then kind of drive home with really what are we saying about the movement when we understand it more in response to all lives matter, red lives and blue lives, right? So what I would like to do is first give you some context. Trayvon Martin's case. Many of you are familiar with Trayvon Martin, but just as a refresher, on February 26th, 2012, Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman engaged in a physical altercation. This happened in Florida, resulting in Martin being shot once in the chest and later died of his wounds. Trayvon Martin was still a teenager at that time. In this case, Florida has a law in the books called Stand Your Ground. It applied in this case, but indirectly. So there's an option in the state of Florida where Stand Your Ground can be applied to a particular case under a number of legal processes that take place. What's important to understand is that Stand Your Ground law was not evoked in this case, but Stand Your Ground law helped shape a lot of the discussion and the jury's understanding about what happened between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman when this occurred. So that's important to understand, okay? And on July 13th, 2013, Zimmerman was acquitted of all charges, including second-degree murder and manslaughter in the killing of Trayvon Martin. This sparked a number of nationwide protests, all right, discussing the concerns with systemic bias, racial bias, as it applies to gun right laws and self-defense laws, particularly in the state of Florida, but all over the country, because Stand Your Ground law doesn't only exist in Florida, but a number of other states. And so rather than before I break down the actual Stand Your Ground legislation, it's important to note that the Black Lives Matter movement was sparked from this case in response to this case. Before I give you the history on that very briefly, what I'd like to do is play for you the George Zimmerman call that occurred on February 26, 2012. I want to share another perspective because remember, snapshot versus movie of a 911 call that came in as a sort of a verbal or a audio witness to this, and then the acquittal, so that we can put ourselves in that moment in time, which we may have forgotten since this case. So let's listen first to the George Zimmerman phone call to 911 regarding Trayvon Martin. I'm going to go ahead and share the phone call, and let's listen. It's short. It's about 4 minutes.
Sanford Police Department. Line is being recorded. Sean.
Hey, we've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a real suspicious guy. It's Retreat View Circle. The best address I can give you is 111 Retreat View Circle. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining, and he's just walking around looking about.
Okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic?
He looks black.
Did you see what he was wearing?
Yeah, a dark hoodie, like a gray hoodie, and either jeans or sweatpants and white tennis shoes. He's here now. He was just staring.
Oh, he's just walking around the area?
At all the houses.
Okay.
Now he's just staring at me.
Okay, and he said it's 1111 Retreat View or 111?
That's the clubhouse.
That's the clubhouse. Do you know what he's near the clubhouse right now?
Yeah, now he's coming towards me.
Okay.
He's got his hand in his waistband. Yeah, he's a black male.
Okay. How old would you say he
He's
looks?
got a button on his shirt. Late teens.
Late teens? Okay.
Something's wrong with him. Yeah. He's coming to check me out. He's got something in his hands. I don't know what his deal is.
Okay, just let me know if he does
Get an
anything,
officer
okay?
over here.
Yeah, we got him on the way. Just let me know if this guy does anything else.
Okay. These assholes, they always get away. Yeah. When you come to the clubhouse, you come straight in and make a left. Actually, you would go past the clubhouse.
Okay, it says on the left-hand side from the clubhouse?
No, you go in straight through the entrance, and then you make a left. Yeah, you go straight in, don't turn and make a left. Shit, he's running.
He's running? Which way is he running?
Down towards the other entrance of the neighborhood.
Okay, which entrance is that he's heading towards?
The back entrance. Fucking dogs.
Are you following him?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't need you to do that.
Okay.
All right, sir, what is your name?
George. He ran.
All right, George, what's your last name?
Zimmerman.
And George, what's the phone number you're calling from?
407-435-2400.
All right, George, we do have him on the way. Do you want to meet with the officer when they get out there?
Yeah.
All right, where are you going to meet with them at?
If they come in through the gate, tell them to go straight past the clubhouse and straight past the clubhouse and make a left. And then they go past the mailboxes. Look at my truck.
Okay, what address are you parked in front of?
I don't know. It's a cut through, so I don't know the address.
Okay, do you live in the area?
Yeah, yeah.
What's your apartment number?
It's a home. It's 1950. Oh, crap. I don't want to give it out loud. I don't know where this kid is.
Okay, do you want to just meet with him right near the mailboxes then?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, George, I'll let him know to meet you with you out there, okay?
Actually, could you have him call me and I'll tell him where I'm at?
Okay, yeah, that's no problem.
You need my number or you got it?
Yeah, I got it. It's 407-435-2400.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, no problem. I'll let them know to call you when they're in the area.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, that's the phone call, right? And it's important to understand this is setting the stage for what transpires next, as well as the legal proceedings that happened following the death of Trayvon Martin. So what's important to understand then is this wasn't the only snapshot, right, that was captured that evening. There was a 911 call that was delivered from a neighbor nearby. I'd like us to listen to that call. It's a little more brief so that we can understand what the public was listening to, certainly what George Zimmerman experienced that night, and from what we can hear, what Trayvon Martin may have experienced, though none of us really know completely what happened that night because he did not survive, right? So here is the second phone call that let's listen to, as a result of the altercation.
911, do you need police, fire, medical?
Maybe both. I'm not sure. There's just someone screaming outside.
Okay, what's the address that they're near?
Yes.
Okay, and is it a male or female?
It sounds like a male.
And you don't know why?
I don't know why. I think they're yelling help, but I don't know. Just send someone quick. Say crap.
Okay. Does he look hurt to you?
I can't see him. I don't want to go out there. I don't know what's going on. So they're sending.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
All right, what is your phone number?
Okay, that's the end of the phone call. Now, what's important to understand here is that part of the outrage and the concern following the incident or the trial was a lot of people were asking around the country, how could this happen? How was it that in the phone call, the 911 phone call placed by George Zimmerman, that when George Zimmerman was told to stop following, said, we don't need you to follow him, that he continued to follow him, ended up in an altercation with Trayvon Martin. Neighbors are hearing this altercation taking place, and then Trayvon Martin ends up dead. How is it that an individual now, let's step back for a second, an individual who is told to not pursue, ends up pursuing in an altercation and is acquitted of all charges of murder, second-degree murder, and even manslaughter in this case, when that individual pursued against advice of 911, fired their firearm, and as a result of that, someone dies. And the public was having a hard time wrapping our heads around, how did that take place? How did this happen? I'd like for a second to break that down, as well as the response and the origin of the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of this case. But first, let's see the decision that was made during the trial, right, of George Zimmerman. This was the acquittal that took place. So let me go ahead and play that. This is 1 minute, and then we'll dissect this case and what happened in relation to Black Lives Matter.
Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? If you'll please fold the verdict form and hand it to Deputy Jarvis. Okay, if you'll please publish the verdict.
In the Circuit Court of the 18th Judicial Circuit in and for Seminole County, Florida, State of Florida versus George Zimmerman. Verdict: we the jury find George Zimmerman not guilty. So say we all foreperson.
Does either side want to poll the jury?
We would, Your Honor.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as your juror number is being called, please.
So that's the end of that, right? This is what happened when George Zimmerman's case was read, and he was acquitted of all charges, right? So here's what's important to understand then. Following the reading of the verdict, right, mass demonstrations began to appear all over the country. And folks said, some said we are outraged at what we saw. And others had said, we are surprised by what we saw. How could this happen? How could someone shoot another person, right? And then legally just walk? How does that work? So there's two different discussions that were occurring. Some folks saying they were outraged, other folks saying they were surprised. We should all be outraged, right? Anytime an individual was killed, let alone under circumstances like this, there should be outrage. Surprisingly enough, though, when we examine the law, we may realize that from the get-go, this case had been decided before it ever went to trial, the outcome of this case. So following this incident that we all saw and examined here, that evening, okay, of the acquittal, after what you just watched right now, Alicia Garza, a Black activist and writer, posted a discussion called A Love Note to Black People. Okay, this is what was posted. In this post, she wrote, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." One of her friends and fellow activists responded with, "Declaration, Black bodies will no longer be sacrificed for the rest of the world's enlightenment. I am done. I am so done. Trayvon, you are loved infinitely. Hashtag Black Lives Matter." And this was beginning to take the form of the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, this phrase in response to the cascade of killings, not the snapshot, but the movie, right, of killings, disproportionate incarceration, arrest, sentencing, and police brutality stats that have existed for centuries. So it's important to understand that sometimes folks look at this Black Lives Matter movement and they interpret it sometimes in society as they believe that what BLM is saying is Black Lives Matter more And then the counter comes up, well, no, it's not only Black Lives Matter, it's all lives matter. And then you'll see counter protesters also saying, well, no, well, blue lives matter because our police are being placed in jeopardy in all of this. And I support law enforcement and we need law enforcement for our communities to be safe, but that's not what Black Lives Matter was saying. So sometimes those responses can sound tone deaf to the origin, the true intent, of what Black Lives Matter was intended to say. Black Lives Matter movement doesn't mean that only Black Lives Matter or that Black Lives Matter more. It simply means that Black Lives Matter too. Again, look at the movie, not the snapshot. Folks that are speaking out against Black Lives Matter and the notion of all lives matter or blue lives matter, what they're going off of is a snapshot. They're saying you just responded to this incident disproportionately, you are overly sensitive, you forget these facts and this and that. But what they're forgetting to see is though the movie that has been played in the life experiences of people of color, of Black and African American individuals is saying historically we have been seeing that our lives simply do not matter as much as other individuals. We value all lives. We're saying, can you please acknowledge that our lives matter too? This is the origin of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I just wanted to share that with you. Now, our final lesson for today, and I want to thank you for getting through this content. I know some of it is very heavy, but I also want to do this with intentionality so we can understand. I made a statement earlier saying that if you are outraged by the decision of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman's case, that's one thing. To be surprised is another, right? Let's look at this stand your ground law in Florida, which again is the law that heavily shaped the understanding and application of what happened in this case for jurors. So jurors only heard one side of the story, right? They only heard George Zimmerman's and the accounts of any other folks that were involved because Trayvon Martin was no longer alive. They also had to apply an understanding of what self-defense means legally in Florida. I mean, each state has their own self-defense laws. In this particular case in Florida, self-defense laws were heavily shaped by stand your ground law. And this is the law. And I want to just highlight a couple of these pieces in red that help understand. The reason why I want to do this is because when I heard what happened right here to Trayvon Martin, my heart was broken, right? I'm listening to the news and watching what happened. And I said to myself, this is absolutely awful, right? I'm outraged. At the same time, we started talking about prosecution, right? And we're starting to learn some of the facts that were coming in of the case regarding George Zimmerman and the self-defense piece that was allegedly being shared. And as I'm listening to what's being shared, I thought to myself, if this is what's going to be portrayed in court, we have a problem on our hands. Because I knew that in Florida, we've got stand your ground, self-defense, okay? That looks very different in the state of Florida. This is what the law says. So again, a trial isn't the outcome of the trial isn't determined based on what we think or how we feel. It's based on the letter of the law, what was interpreted on the letter of this law. This is what was interpreted. This was what was applied in that case. So understand your ground law, a person who is in a dwelling or residence in which the person has a right to be, has no duty to retreat and has the right to stand his or her ground and use or threaten to use force. What this means is if an individual, George Zimmerman in this case, is driving through an area in which he lives, a dwelling or residence, somewhere where he has a right to be, okay, because he's from the area, he doesn't have to retreat if there's a threat. Okay, so when, he was told you don't need to follow, when things started to get heavy, whatever occurred between him and Trayvon Martin, he was under no legal duty to have to retreat, to leave that threat, no duty to retreat, okay? And so this permitted him at this point to use deadly force if he or she reasonably believes that using or threatening to use such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or, listen to this, great bodily harm. Not even death, but great bodily harm. Now, a lot of folks were then asking the question, 17-year-old versus this guy with a gun, what would great bodily harm look like? Again, we don't know exactly what happened in this case because we only heard one side. The person against whom the defensive force was used or threatened was in the process of unlawfully or forcefully entering or had unlawfully or forcibly entered a dwelling place. This was the premise of some of the suspicion that George Zimmerman was sharing in the beginning of this, again, making assumptions that Trayvon Martin didn't have a right to be there. And then the person against whom the defensive force is used or threatened has the right to be or is in a lawful resident or dwelling. So this piece here of legislation set the ground for that. So what's important to understand then is, let's go back to snapshot, right, and movie. If you're a person of color, or let's say you identify as Black or African American, and you see the result of what took place for Trayvon Martin's, George Zimmerman's case and Trayvon Martin's death. Some people looked at this as a snapshot and said, wow, this is outrageous. This is unbelievable. We should do something about this. To other people who are living the movie, they said, yeah, that's an awful snapshot. And guess what? It can happen to me tomorrow. It can happen to my aunt tomorrow. It can happen to my cousin tomorrow. This is why it's important to understand, just for moments, to put ourselves in the shoes of others, even if we don't live the same life that they do, right? Some of us wake up in the morning and we don't have to worry about going for a jog or a walk. We don't have to be worried that if we're wearing a hoodie, we'll be interpreted as a robber by someone. This is why some people, when they wake up and their spouse goes for a run, they look at them and say, is that what you're going to wear when you go out? Because people are going to think you're a thug. This is why when some people go out into public, they're conscious of who's watching them, who's following them, because they're worried about someone going rogue and assuming the worst of them and it leading to a situation like this. Again, snapshot versus movie. Occasionally, it's important for us to step away from the snapshot and to try to, the best we can, enter an understanding of the movie that is experienced and lived by others, right? So again, I just wanted to clarify just where we were going with the discussions around race and racism in this country. Sometimes the assumptions that we make without fully looking into some of the legislation, the origin of Black Lives Matter movement, some of the facts surrounding the case. And again, I know this isn't an exhaustive discussion on it, but an important one nonetheless that we can dive into when we return, right? So I really want to thank you for your patience. And so what I'm going to do is we'll go ahead and close out today's lesson. And what I would like to do is go ahead and close us out with our centering activity for today. And I want to just acknowledge for a fact, let me just bring up that slide one last time. It was being a little stubborn with us today. I want to acknowledge and thank you all for the fact that I know that these discussions aren't easy, right? I know that they put us in a place of feeling uncomfortable, but it's important that the only way that we can really grow, right, or be transformed is through sometimes a process of being willing and courageous to look at tough topics and have a discussion around them. Not an argument, but a genuine discussion, right? So I look forward to that when we return. So let's go ahead and key into the scripture verse for today. Let's actually go with this one. Again, sorry if it's not Monday for us when we're watching, but still always great time, right, to review some scripture and to center. So let's go ahead and examine this scripture verse coming from Psalm 50. The Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you. And we'll go with the word to focus on today as merciful. So let's go ahead and put our hands and feet in a nice comfortable position. Let's go ahead and for a moment, let's ask God to take some of the weight that we're carrying, right? The tension, the discomfort, maybe some of the sorrow that we're feeling. And let's allow God to take that and let's unload that for a second, right? Because we know that our God is merciful. He will not leave us alone. He will not let us be in this moment of destroying, right? And let's think about how God might speak mercy into our hearts today. What does mercy look like for us? So go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Try to push out all those concerns, right? Let's just focus on the fact that God's present with us in this moment. He was present with us during this entire conversation, this lesson today, right? He'll be present with us when we're done. And let's take a nice deep breath, close our eyes, and I'll keep track of the time and close us out in 2 minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and open our eyes, take a nice deep breath, and come on back. Folks, I want to thank you again for being such amazing students. Thank you for diving into the content. Thank you for always bringing your questions and our discussions. I so look forward to meeting with you all again in person. I can't wait for that. And I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.